I'm going to move over here in just a minute because we're going to have a conversation about the Constitution and whether the Congress and the balance that was written into that machinery by James Madison and others is working as well as it should, and if it's not, what might be done about it. And the conversation is going to include two people who really don't need an introduction, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. The first one is Tom Coburn from Oklahoma, who came to, who actually, first in the House and then when he came back in the Senate, has done the hard work that so many congressmen avoid, has looked at spending and has made specific proposals about what is and what is not proper spending under our form of government and has tried to make the cuts. That's very hard work, and there are darn few members of either the House or the Senate who really spend the time necessary to look through it and do that. The Senate's going to miss Tom Coburn when he retires and goes back to Oklahoma at the end of this year. But I think that he's got some things that, observations that he might make as a senator leaving that, well, knowing Tom, he'd have made him even if he wasn't leaving. So he's going to be joined by George Will, who you all know. George Will's, in my opinion, is the premier conservative columnist in the United States today. That's a mantle that was once worn by Bill Buckley, but George wears that mantle today, and I'm very honored that we have him here today because he's thought more deeply about these things and others than most of us have, and all of his observations are going to be worth listening to. Now, I'm told, and I'm not a technological expert, but I am told that when we finish our conversation or even in the middle of it, you can tweet. I'm an old guy, so I don't do things like this. You can tweet to us a question or any questions that you might have, and then I will inject those questions into the conversation. And so with that, Tom and George, I think we're going to sit over here.
Thank you, David.
And they didn't give me the damn iPad.
You could be in our middle.
Yep. May never be able to get up.
I'll help you.
Gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. In the course of the last couple of years in particular, but it's been going on longer than that, there's been a growing concern about the separation of powers, the balance of power. Every once in a while we worry, and as we should, about accretions of power to the executive branch. I think a number of other speakers have mentioned some of the things that have been going on. A president who revises laws after they've been passed and signed, a president and a Justice Department that announces that if they like a law, they'll enforce it. If they don't, they won't enforce it. All of the other things that have been going on that you might want to delve into. The question, though, today is why is this happening and what can be done about it? And I know we all have a perspective on that. The Constitution, and I think most people here refer to themselves often as constitutional conservatives. The Constitution provides a mechanism for government that's really much like capitalism. It's to take imperfect human beings, pit them against each other, and come up presumably with a system that will harness their greed, cancel it out against each other as they all vie for power, with the result that we have a limited government and the people would be free, or largely free. And the question is, over the course of the last few decades, as we've built a super administrative state, as we've had president after president ask for, oftentimes and sometimes just grab more power, what is happening to our system, and what do we need to do to sort of bring it back on keel if in fact we think it's off keel? George, why don't I ask you to start, because you've written on this over the years.
The first thing I'd say is that Mr. Obama has taken a lot of pre-existing trends, bad ones, and made them worse. But we ought to understand that Republican presidents including the last one, use signing statements. They'd sign a bill and say, I hereby sign this bill, except I don't intend to enforce X, Y, and Z. So this has been a problem actually that is older than the Republic. Our country was founded in reaction against executive overreach, the prerogatives of the British sovereign. The Declaration of Independence is a litany of complaints about executive overreach. Conservatism, in its modern form, was born in reaction against two overreaching presidents, Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. There was a kind of conservative preference for congressional supremacy. Indeed, one of the great texts of modern conservatism was James Burnham's book, Congress and the American Tradition, which was written while he was one of the founding editors of National Review. The problem is that the healthy suspicion of presidential power tended to weaken among conservatives because they had the heady and delightful experience of their own president in Ronald Reagan. And I think one of the things conservatives need to do is reacquire suspicion of executive power, reacquire a preference for the Congress. Begin by visiting the National Archives, where when you look at the parchment copy of the Constitution in the rotunda there, you'll see that half of the Constitution is Article 1, because Congress is the first branch of government in so many ways. Second, conservatives have to understand that as long as government grows, Congress's sway over the government will recede. As more and more power will leak into the bureaucracy, Congress will be always too busy to say quite what it means. It will pass laws that are not so much laws as sentiments. They'll say we ought to have adequate public education, and they'll turn it over to the Education Department to write 20,000 pages of regulations to tell Congress the implications of what it has said. It's a leakage away of congressional power. And finally, conservatives have to turn to the courts and find some friends in the court. They have to find a way to get the courts to acknowledge that Tom Coburn should have standing to sue the president if the president is violating the intent of the Congress of which he is a member. Courts have been very reluctant to referee arguments between the branches of government, and I understand that. But it's time for the Congress to make its case, and for conservatives to amend their vocabulary a bit. Conservatives have been much too dogmatic in denouncing what they call judicial activism. What we really want is a properly engaged judiciary, and part of the proper engagement of the judiciary is to referee the violations of the separation of powers.
Senator, you've been up there, you've watched this, and one gets the impression sometimes, do members of Congress actually want the power that they're supposed to covet? In other words, there was a proposal recently that the authors of which suggested an amendment to the Constitution that would require the Congress to essentially put its fingerprints on major regulatory efforts by the executive branch, either approving or not approving. And the people involved in it said they talked to a dozen congressmen. They all said, well, we don't want that. We don't want to do that because so much has been left to the regulatory authorities within the executive branch that a lot of congressmen who don't pay much attention, they can whine about it, but their fingerprints aren't on it. What's your experience in the Senate with the seriousness of people thinking about or being willing to fight for the institutional prerogatives of the body that you served in?
Well, I think underlying all of that is a poor work ethic in Congress. I agree with George. The biggest problem in Congress is we're not specific in what we legislate. And so you have the call, which I'm a big supporter of, a convention of the states, because one of the first things you do is you give the Congress, if we're not going to fulfill our responsibility to be specific about what our intentions are, then we ought to have a responsibility and the authority to cancel out when the regulations and the bureaucracy go way beyond what our intent was. And so first of all, there's a laziness, a lack of a work ethic, the second is the Enumerated Powers Act, which John Shadegg, former congressman from Arizona, originally penned, and I'm a sponsor in the Senate, which says you ought to reconnect with the Constitution when you're legislating. Where do you have the authority to do this as granted by the enumerated powers? So I think we've given up a lot of power, but I think it's not power that we had to give up. It's power that we're so lazy that we don't want to do the hard work. You know, we just had a veterans bill on the floor where I contrasted what the Senate Veterans Committee had done compared to the House. The House had 60 hearings last year on veterans, 34 of them oversight to figure out why we're not doing better. The Senate had 15, 4 were oversight, and you couldn't really call them oversight. So where's the work that we're paid to do to protect the Constitution, one? Number two, to gain the knowledge with which to solve real problems. And I'd say that that's all a function of the lack of leadership in our congressional bodies and the lack of directed leadership with the Constitution in mind as here's how we should go about that. Here, what are our goals? If we truly want a limited government, then it's up to us to force those votes to make us have a limited government and to reinforce congressional intent. The other point I'd make is we're now running not under the rule of law, we're running under the rule of rulers. And when the very thing that binds us together as a nation is confidence in the rule of law. And that's where leadership comes in again. Poor leadership undermines that. Good leadership reinforces that. So I think we've given up a lot of power, but it doesn't have to be that way. That's why I think the idea of any regulation that has an impact of $100 million or more in the economy ought to have to be approved by Congress. You know, is this what you intended? Did you really mean to labor onto the economy $100 million worth of additional regulation?
What about as you watch what's going on now, you see and George is absolutely right. This just didn't start with Barack Obama. It started a long time ago under presidents of both parties, as more power was surrendered or seized by the executive branch to do a lot of these things. But much of it, if the Congress isn't willing to stand up, then individual congressmen don't have, or it's hard to get standing, even when there's a blatant violation of a constitutional provision, to go to the courts to do anything about it. So what do you think should be done? What kinds of changes can be done? You talked about constitutional changes, and I remember back in the 80s when we had the fights about the balanced budget amendment, and the chairman of the group that was in favor of it then was Barbara Conable, a moderate congressman from New York, and he was asked by a New York Times reporter, why would you be for this? And he said, because I've served in this body. And unless there's some discipline, there's not going to be any change. And it has to be discipline institutionally and structurally forced upon the body. Now, the design of the Constitution was that these people, as the Congress tried to grab power and the executive tried to grab power, all of that would work out. And it doesn't seem to be working out. And so what's your...
Well, you're quite right. Madison in Federalist 51 said, "We see throughout our system the process of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives. Our system's designed to run even if no one has good motives. Certainly no one has good motives all the time." That said, it seemed to be, as long as the government grows, Congress's power will recede. We've had 435 members of the House for what, about a century now? Imagine what the government was a century ago. 435 people could actually more or less follow what the government was doing. Jim Buckley, Bill Buckley's brother, came to the Senate in 1971. He left in 1977. He told me at one point he thinks the workload doubled in his 6 years there. Because try and think of something today, anything that is not considered a federal responsibility. You can't. And that's a sea change. The great political scientist, James Q. Wilson, said the real change occurred in the 1960s, and he located it with the first passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, of which, by the way, No Child Left Behind is, I guess, the 9th iteration. He said, once you crossed that line, that primary and secondary education was a legitimate concern of the federal government, the legitimacy barrier was down. There was no way of saying this, that, or the other thing was not a proper federal responsibility. So again, we have to rethink fundamentally what the federal government is up to and send as much of it as possible back to the states.
Right. Just, I talked to Jim Buckley this week. We'd invited him down here for other reasons, and he told me that unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, that he was celebrating his 91st birthday this weekend, and therefore couldn't come down here. I said, I think that you only get to do that once. You ought to,
That's right.
you ought to stay up there and do it. Is the concern, I mean, obviously, I remember when I came to Washington in 1970, I opened up the Washington Post, and this goes to your point, and they were having hearings in the Senate about whether or not football teams should be allowed to play on AstroTurf. And I thought, well, if that's part of their responsibility, then so is everything else. And you've worked on the Hill, and as have I, and you've served in both houses. And I think George's point that there's so much and there's so many things going on that it's very difficult to get your hands on it. Part of it is to send that back to the, to revitalize federalism.
Well,
because that's what works.
44 years after you opened the Post and saw Congress worrying about AstroTurf, there are people in Congress who want to legislate on the name of the Washington NFL team.
Right.
So nothing has changed.
Yeah, exactly. And what makes, I mean, you just can't seem to, it seems to me, focus on important things if all of your time is spent on things that you have no business focusing on, and which, regardless of how it comes out, is going to have no impact whatever on the freedoms or the prosperity of the American people. The difficulty there is, and this is where the founders were right, I've often thought that if a politician is in the States, he thinks the decision should be made there if you promote him, and he comes to Washington, he thinks the decisions ought to be made there, because most politicians think that the decisions ought to be made where he is, and ideally by him, rather than by someone else.
But you're relating to the defect of career politicians. The fact is you put your own best interest ahead of what you know the Constitution intended our framers and founders believed in, and so we subjugate that to the best interest of the political career of the members of Congress. That's why term limits is an absolute must to solve the problems in this country. The second thing is to hold people really accountable, which we no longer do in terms of elective office, of what did you accomplish? And there shouldn't be just one waste book every year. There ought to be 535 waste books. Mm-hmm. There ought to be 535 members doing the oversight and creating the transparency so that the American people actually know what's happening inside their government instead of working to make sure they don't know. And so the conflict on both sides of the aisle is my political career trumps the best interests and thoughts of our founders. And that's where we are today. That's why, again, a convention of the states.
Didn't the founders assume they'd think that way?
I think so. But we're not going to get term limits. I feel so strongly about the issue that I wrote an entire book advocating it. A 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court said that this term limits is a change in the qualifications for office. Therefore, it's a constitutional question. Therefore, states can't impose limits on their congressional delegation by statute. Therefore, we're not going to get it because they're never going to send to the states for ratification. By they, I mean the Congress of the United States, an amendment to the Constitution that would limit their careers. There is, however, another way of doing this. Warren Buffett says rightly, we could have a balanced budget by next Thursday if we passed a constitutional amendment that said, no sitting member of Congress shall be eligible to run for re-election unless there's a balanced budget.
Mm-hmm. But is your consensus that you're not going to, simply by electing better people, you're not going to change the drift that we're going in? That you really do need institutional rearrangements or institutional safeguards or something that tweak the existing system in a way that will get it back on track as the founders believed it should work.
I don't despair of making substantial changes by changing personnel. Personnel is policy.
Important.
At the end of the day.
Right.
Give me half a dozen more Tom Coburns, we wouldn't be up here talking like this.
I'm not sure there are a half a dozen more.
Oh, sure there is. Look, I would make this point. I didn't have any political experience. I would be the last person in my high school anybody ever thought would be a U.S. Senator. The fact is I was fed up. I know what the Constitution says, and I cared. So leadership makes a difference. You can make a difference. And what we need, and here's one of our defects in our society today, the people that know that refuse to come and sacrifice their time, their money, and their reputations to make the changes that are necessary here. There's hundreds of thousands of Tom Coburns out there. Mm-hmm. The question is will they make the sacrifice to come up here and get beat up to do what they know is in the best long-term interest of our country? And so what we ought to be doing is recruiting those that have benefited so greatly from this country, that have all this skill and knowledge, that have accomplished so much in the private sector, to come up here and to contribute to realigning and getting us back in the direction that our founders intended us to go. So what we get to choose from is usually people who are wanting to rise on the political career rather than people who want to change what's wrong. And I would tell you, we have plenty of people in this country to do it. What we have to do is call on their good nature to say, come and sacrifice, help fix our country.
Well, now that's something that the people in this room can help with, because they can help identify those people, and there are probably people in this room who fall precisely into that category.
Absolutely.
Who are willing to get out there and make the sacrifices necessary.
One of the points you're making is that there are limits to what personnel can do if the personnel is in the legislative branch. The real problem is that presidencies have their own momentum, and they have such enormous institutional advantages in the presidency that if you have a president who is reluctant to restrain himself, he's not going to be restrained. To that extent, the Newtonian system that the founders put together with these opposing forces is failing right now, partly because modern instruments of technology and communication so favor the single executive. But what that means is that Republicans particularly have to be careful about who they nominate for president. They have to, in the vetting process, they have to ask their prospective chief executives if the chief executive has some sense of proper institutional modesty about the executive branch and a consequent understanding of the dignity and role of the legislative branch.
That's right.
I agree. Mm-hmm. But that's where true leadership matters.
Yes.
Just think if we had a president who could win, that was a conservative that says, I'm going to right-size the executive branch. I'm going to lead on the thing. We have $250 billion worth of duplicative programs, that most of which don't work, that we're spending money on every year, according to the GAO. If we had a president that led on that and said, I'm going to veto any appropriation bills that doesn't come through here, eliminating all this duplication. So the question is really, are we going to elect a leader who understands what our real problems are, understands what potential solutions are, and will exert the leadership and call on the country to force Congress? I'd just say one other thing, George. I think term limits are possible because I think congressmen and senators want to get reelected enough that if the country demanded term limits and they voted against it, they wouldn't get reelected, and those that voted for it would, and we'd get term limits.
Good.
Sometimes these things, and they become partisan rather than principled, so that when Republicans are in the White House, as when George W. Bush was in the White House, Democrats were complaining, actually accurately, that he was seizing more power than the Constitution contemplated him having. But then, of course, when they get into the White House, then the Republicans complain that they're grabbing more power than is necessary. To what extent? I was struck last summer by this Robert Turley from GW. It was very liberal, who testified before Congress and said he believed that the country is reaching a tipping point on constitutional power and obligations. And he said, I say that as one who supports everything that Barack Obama wants to do, but I think he's doing it in a dangerous, very dangerous way. Or I thought of, I was one senator when Harry Reid exercised the so-called nuclear option to get rid of the filibuster, finally went to him and said, okay, go ahead and do it. And then when we're in the majority, watch what we do to you, which of course is the danger of changing the arrangements to benefit you when you're in power. To what extent do you think that there's at least a possibility that, that there's going to be a broader understanding of the fact that we may be approaching what Turley calls a tipping point, so that there'll be others joining in trying to do this, regardless of who the president is?
I don't think the public understands the problem at this point. I think if you listen to presidential rhetoric, the presidential rhetoric is in tune with what the public expects. And the presidential rhetoric is, if I am elected president, I will create jobs. If I am president, I will clean the air. If I am presidents don't do any of that stuff. Presidents execute the will of the legislative branch.
Faithfully execute the law.
Faithfully execute. And if it would be lovely to have, in fact, I'm going to vote for the next person who runs for president saying, if I'm elected, I'm really not going to do that much by myself. If I'm elected, I'm going to try and work with the representatives of the American people to make modest improvements. I mean, the American people at this point are not looking for paradise. They're looking for basic elementary competence. Right. And I think the competence of charisma and the charisma of competence is maybe the secret to electoral success with an American public that has a healthy deflation now of its expectations from the presidency.
You know, the Pew poll, I think it was, showed for the first time really in history that now in recent polling data that more Americans are afraid of their government than think their government can do good for them. I mean, there have always been some Americans who are as paranoid as we are, but now it appears that a majority...
They're called anti-federalists.
Yeah. That a majority has taken that position. Does that create a different atmosphere where it is possible, perhaps, for somebody to say what you're talking about, to say, look, you know, we've had this ride, you know, we've tried all these things, we've done all these things, and what's been the result of it? Nothing that's been good for us or future generations. Let's cut back, either with institutional changes, whether it's term limits or whether it's the regulatory amendment or whatever, or by getting a candidate who can appeal along those lines.
No, this is a moment to turn to the American people and say, in the vast, sprawling, metastasizing blob that is the federal bureaucracy, how many lowest learners are that we don't know about? The answer is a lot of them.
Yeah, but that happens, George, because it's unchecked power.
That's right.
Because Congress fails to do its oversight role. And if you had Congress effectively, from either side of the aisle, effectively creating transparency for the American public, the sunshine will cure most of that. But we don't have any sunshine because we don't have the effort put forward in the Congress to actually do the vigorous oversight to expose it. The American people aren't stupid. If they see what's going on, they'll change it.
And another sign that the American people aren't stupid is they more often than not produce divided government. Imagine today if Republicans didn't control the gavels in one of the houses of Congress. Nothing would be being done about the IRS. Now, the IRS is the most intrusive and potentially punitive institution of the federal government. It has been turned into an appendage of the ruling party, and we would be able to do nothing about this if there weren't Republican chairmen in the House. If the Republicans should win the White House in 2016, there'll be a real case to be made that good conservatives should want one of the houses of Congress to be in the control of the other party for precisely the reason Tom is talking about. Well, if you think Republicans aren't capable of abusing power, you should have been here when he and I got here in 1970.
Well, back in 1994, a reporter asked Newt Gingrich, when the Republicans took over the House of Representatives, whether he believed that somehow Democrats were more congenitally dishonest and power-hungry than Republicans. And Gingrich said, no, it's just that they've had 40 years to do it. He said, but if we're in for 40 years, we'll be just as bad. It turned out we had a faster learning curve. But I do think that we have here, I mean, this is a great concern, and I think that we're in a position now where some of the things that we've talked about resonate in ways that they might not have resonated a decade ago or even 5 years ago.
Let me just take a moment to explain why this happens. There's not anybody in this audience that doesn't want to really help people who need our help, right? Everybody wants to help the people who really need our help. Today, our policies are endangering our ability to help the people that really need help. And so our clarion call ought to be is we're for those that need our help. We just want to do it effectively and smartly so that, in fact, they're helped further along when they get out of the hole they're in and they have opportunity. And yet you hardly hear us talk about us being champions for those that need our help. And we have effective ways of doing that that don't waste money, that don't bankrupt the future, and don't, when this all falls apart, which I'm really worried about it financially for our country, the people that are going to be hurt the most are going to be the people they say we care about that need our help. They're the ones that are going to suffer. So, you know, we have a great moral ground to fight from if we would verbalize it and explain what we mean by that. You know, unemployment insurance to somebody that keeps them from getting a skill or going to work or doing public service or learning a new trade is not a good thing for that individual. So when we help, we ought to be helping, not hindering.
So there is, amidst the pessimism, there's reason for optimism as well.
Absolutely.
And I have to apologize because the conversation was so interesting that I thought you'd like to hear that, so we didn't get to questions and we're under time constraints. But I really want to thank George Will and Senator Coburn for being with us here today, because I happen to think, and I hope that you share the belief, that this is one of the most important challenges that this country has, because all of the other, or many of the other problems that we have flow from the inability to get this balance right. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.